An 8-year-old girl living in extreme poverty on Seattle's streets manages to calm the 4-year-old autistic son of a billionaire CEO by making paper airplanes during an airport crisis. The boy had been crying inconsolably for hours, preventing his father, Richard Sterling, from concentrating on the most important conference call of his life, a negotiation that would save his company from bankruptcy. Moved by the girl's pure kindness, Richard decides to investigate her story to help her. When he hires a private detective, he discovers hospital records that reveal a devastating truth. The girl is his biological daughter, born from a relationship 9 years ago with a nurse who died in childbirth. The child was reported dead by corrupt doctors who sold her on the black market, while Richard mourned for years the loss of a daughter who was actually alive. Surviving alone on the streets of the city where he built his empire. Before we begin this incredible journey, please hit that like button if you're ready for a story that will touch your heart. And don't forget to comment below. I love hearing your thoughts as we go through this emotional roller coaster together. Richard Sterling pressed his Bluetooth earpiece harder against his ear, desperately trying to focus on the voice of his Japanese investors, while his 4-year-old son Mason screamed at the top of his lungs in the busy Seattle-Tacoma airport terminal. The boy's cries pierced through every conversation around them, causing passengers to stare with mixtures of sympathy and annoyance. "Mr. Sterling, we need your decision now," came the urgent voice of Hiroshi Tanaka through the static. "The board won't wait any longer. Either you accept our terms, or Sterling Industries faces complete bankruptcy within 48 hours. Richard ran his free hand through his graying hair, his expensive suit wrinkled from hours of travel delays. At 42, he'd built a tech empire worth $3 billion, but right now he felt completely powerless against his son's meltdown. Mason, diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder 2 years ago, had been crying for 3 straight hours since their connecting flight was cancelled due to the storm. "I understand the gravity of the situation, Tanaka-san," Richard said, trying to project confidence while bouncing Mason gently in his arms. "Just give me 5 more minutes to review the final numbers, and I'll have your answer." But Mason's screams only intensified, and Richard could hear the frustration in his investor's voice as the line crackled with interference. Around them, the terminal buzzed with delayed passengers, crying babies and angry travelers, but none as distressed as his little boy. Richard's wife, Diana, had died in a car accident when Mason was just 18 months old, leaving Richard to navigate single parenthood while running a multinational corporation. He'd hired the best nannies, the most qualified therapists, but moments like these reminded him how alone he truly was in this battle. "Mason, please," he whispered desperately, feeling his business empire slipping away with each passing second. The Tanaka deal wasn't just about money. It was about saving the jobs of 15,000 employees who'd trusted him with their livelihoods. As he paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, Richard noticed other passengers beginning to stare openly. Some whispered among themselves, probably recognizing him from business magazines. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd been featured on Forbes's cover as the CEO who has it all couldn't even calm his own son. That's when he saw her, a small figure sitting alone on a bench across from their gate, watching them with curious brown eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. Lucy Chen Martinez had been living in the shadows of Seattle for as long as she could remember, but she'd never seen a man cry the way the well-dressed stranger was crying now. Not the angry tears of the drunk men who sometimes chased her away from warm doorsteps, but quiet, desperate tears that spoke of a heart breaking in real time. At 8 years old, Lucy had learned to read people's emotions like weather patterns. It was a survival skill that had kept her alive on the streets for 3 years. Ever since the last foster family had given up on her, she could spot danger from 50 yards away, identify which restaurant workers might slip her leftover food, and sense when someone was safe enough to approach. This man with the crying boy felt safe, despite his expensive clothes that marked him as someone from a different world entirely. Lucy had been following them for the past hour, fascinated by the way the man spoke in hushed, urgent tones into his phone, while never once losing patience with the screaming child. Most adults would have yelled by now, but this father just kept murmuring gentle words and rubbing the boy's back with infinite tenderness. She recognized the child's distress. It reminded her of her younger foster brother Miguel, who used to have similar episodes before the social workers separated them 2 years ago. Miguel had been autistic too, though the foster parents had never bothered to get him properly diagnosed. Lucy had discovered that certain repetitive motions and soft sounds could sometimes break through his panic. Rising from her bench, Lucy approached slowly, the way she'd learned to approach frightened animals. She was thin for her age, her clothes a mixture of donations from various shelters, her dark hair pulled back with a rubber band she'd found on the sidewalk. But her eyes held a warmth that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within her small frame. "Excuse me, mister," she said softly, tugging gently on Richard's jacket sleeve. Richard looked down, momentarily startled to see a child addressing him. Through his earpiece, Tanaka's voice was growing more impatient by the second. "Not now, sweetheart," Richard said kindly but firmly, assuming she was another traveler's child. "I'm in the middle of something very important." But Lucy didn't move away. Instead, she reached into her small backpack and pulled out a piece of paper, a napkin she'd saved from McDonald's earlier that day. With practiced movements, she began folding it with the precision of someone who'd done this countless times before. "Sometimes paper airplanes help," she whispered, her voice barely audible above Mason's cries. Richard Sterling had closed billion-dollar deals in boardrooms around the world, but he'd never seen anything quite like what happened next. The homeless girl, for he could see now from her worn clothes and thin frame that she was clearly living rough, folded that McDonald's napkin into the most perfect paper airplane he'd ever seen. Her small fingers moved with an artist's precision, creating crisp edges and symmetrical wings that seemed to defy the humble material she was working with. "Mason," she said gently, holding the paper airplane at his eye level. "Look." Something in her voice, perhaps its musical quality, or the complete absence of the urgent tension that had surrounded them all day, made the 4-year-old boy pause mid-cry. His tear-streaked face turned toward Lucy, his blue eyes focusing on the white paper creation in her hands. "Watch," Lucy whispered, and with a gentle push, she sent the airplane soaring across the terminal. It flew in a perfect arc, gliding past a businessman with his laptop, over a mother feeding her baby, and landed softly near the departure board. Mason stopped crying completely. The silence was so sudden and profound that Richard almost forgot about the urgent voice still crackling through his earpiece. Around them, other passengers began to notice the miraculous calm that had descended over their previously chaotic corner of the terminal. "Another one?" Lucy asked Mason, already reaching for another piece of paper. This time, what looked like a homework assignment with a big red F marked at the top. Mason nodded eagerly, clapping his small hands together. For the first time all day, he was truly present, his attention completely captured by this magical stranger who spoke his language without saying a word. As Lucy folded the second airplane, Richard found himself studying her more closely. Despite her obvious poverty, she moved with a quiet dignity that spoke of an inner strength far beyond her years. Her clothes were clean but patched, her shoes held together with duct tape, but her smile was radiant as she worked. "Mr. Sterling!" Tanaka's voice snapped through the earpiece with increasing urgency. "Are you still there? We're running out of time." "Yes," Yes, I'm here, Richard replied, but his attention was split between the crucial negotiation and the small miracle happening right in front of him. As Lucy launched the second airplane, Mason giggled, actually giggled, for the first time in days. "Who taught you to make airplanes like that?" Richard found himself asking. Lucy paused, her expression growing momentarily sad. "My mama," she said quietly. "She said airplanes carry wishes to heaven." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, reminding him suddenly and painfully of Sarah, Mason's mother, who used to say similar things about butterflies and dandelion seeds before the accident took her away. As Lucy folded her third airplane, this one made from what appeared to be a page torn from a children's book, Richard Sterling made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his earpiece entirely, ignoring Tanaka's increasingly frantic voice, and knelt down to Lucy's eye level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently. "Lucy," she replied, not meeting his eyes as she concentrated on creating perfect wing creases. "Lucy Chen Martinez." "And where are your parents, Lucy?" The question hung in the air between them like a held breath. Lucy's hands stilled for just a moment before she continued folding. "Don't have any," she said matter-of-factly. "It's just me now." Richard felt his heart constrict. This beautiful, generous child was alone in the world, living God knows where, surviving God knows how. Meanwhile, Mason had settled completely, watching Lucy's every movement with fascination, occasionally making soft, cooing sounds of delight. "Mr. Sterling." His assistant's voice came through the discarded earpiece, tinny and distant. "The Japanese delegation is threatening to walk. They're saying this is unprofessional." For 37 years of his life, Richard Sterling had put business first. Even after Diana's death, even through Mason's diagnosis and all the challenges that followed. The company had remained his primary focus. Sterling Industries wasn't just his legacy, it was his identity, his purpose, his way of providing for his son's future. But as he watched this homeless child bring joy to his son with nothing more than folded paper and boundless compassion, something fundamental shifted in his priorities. "Lucy," he said carefully, "are you hungry?" She nodded once, still not meeting his eyes, as if admitting hunger was somehow shameful. Richard stood up and walked to where his earpiece lay on the floor, the distant sounds of his business empire crumbling still echoing from its tiny speaker. He picked it up and spoke clearly into the device. "Tanaka-san, I need to call you back in 1 hour. Mr. Sterling, this is completely unacceptable. We have deadlines." Richard disconnected the call and turned off his phone entirely. The silence that followed felt both terrifying and liberating. In that moment, Richard Sterling chose his humanity over his corporation, his heart over his bank account. He had no idea if Sterling Industries would survive the next 24 hours, but he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't walk away from this child. "Lucy," he said, his voice stronger now, "would you like to have dinner with Mason and me? There's a nice restaurant upstairs, and I think we need to talk." Lucy looked up at him then, her brown eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Really? Really?" Richard confirmed, lifting Mason into his arms. His son immediately began babbling happily, holding one of Lucy's paper airplanes like a precious treasure. As they walked toward the restaurant together, the billionaire, his autistic son, and the homeless girl who'd changed everything with an act of pure kindness, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had been orchestrated by forces far beyond his understanding. He had no way of knowing that the greatest revelation of his life was still waiting to be discovered. The Cloud City restaurant on the airport's upper level was nearly empty due to the storm delays, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the lightning-streaked Seattle skyline. Richard had requested a quiet corner table, partly for privacy and partly because Mason always did better in less stimulating environments. Lucy sat across from them, her eyes wide as she took in the white tablecloths, crystal glasses, and elegant place settings. She kept her hands folded in her lap, as if afraid to touch anything that looked so expensive. Her worn sneakers barely reached the floor from the high-backed chair, making her seem even smaller and more vulnerable. "Order whatever you want," Richard said gently, sliding the leather-bound menu toward her. "And I mean anything." Lucy stared at the menu for a long moment, her lips moving slightly as she sounded out the more complex words. Richard suspected she might be struggling with some of the elaborate descriptions, but her determination was evident in the way her brow furrowed with concentration. Finally, she looked up with a shy smile that transformed her entire face. "Could I maybe have a hamburger? And some fries? I haven't had fries in a really long time." The simple request hit Richard like a punch to the chest. When was the last time this child had eaten a proper meal? Of course, and maybe some chocolate cake for dessert. Her face lit up like Christmas morning, her eyes growing impossibly wide. "Really? Like real chocolate cake? With frosting?" "Really," Richard confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to Mason, who was systematically arranging Lucy's paper airplanes in a perfect line across his placemat, organizing them by size with the methodical precision that was characteristic of his autism. "And what would you like, buddy?" "Chicken nuggets," Mason announced happily, holding up one of Lucy's airplanes like a trophy. "And Lucy airplanes." "Keep Lucy airplanes forever," Lucy giggled, a sound so pure and joyful that Richard felt tears prick at his eyes. When was the last time he'd heard Mason laugh with such uninhibited delight? When was the last time his son had connected so immediately and completely with another person as they waited for their food? Richard found himself studying Lucy more intently. There was something hauntingly familiar about her features, the shape of her eyes, the way she tilted her head slightly to the left when she was thinking, the graceful movement of her hands as she folded napkins into increasingly elaborate paper creations. But that was impossible. He'd never met this child before in his life, yet the sense of recognition continued to gnaw at him, like a song he couldn't quite remember, but knew he'd heard before. "Lucy," he said carefully, leaning forward slightly, "can you tell me about your family, your parents?" Lucy's smile faded slightly, but she didn't seem uncomfortable discussing it. If anything, she appeared relieved to have someone genuinely interested in her story. "My mama died when I was 5, she said, her voice matter-of-fact in the way children adapt to tragedy. "She was real sick for a long time. The cancer made her tired, but she still made me paper airplanes every day until she couldn't anymore." Richard felt his chest tighten. "And your father?" Lucy shook her head, creating another perfect airplane from her napkin with practiced ease. "I never met my daddy. Mama said he was a good man, a really good man, but he didn't know about me. She said it was her fault, not his." "Your mother never told him she was pregnant?" Richard asked, fighting to keep his voice neutral, despite the growing sense of unease settling in his stomach. Lucy continued folding, her small fingers working with surprising dexterity. "Mama said it was complicated. She said sometimes grown-ups make hard choices to protect the people they love, even when those choices hurt." She looked up at Richard with those wise, ancient eyes. "She said my daddy was going through something really hard when I was born, and she didn't want to make it worse for him." The waiter arrived with their drinks, chocolate milk for Lucy and Mason, black coffee for Richard, but he barely registered the interruption. Something about Lucy's story was tugging at memories he'd tried to bury years ago, pulling at threads he'd thought were permanently severed. "Lucy," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the tremor in his hands. "Can you tell me your mother's name?" Lucy took a careful sip of her chocolate milk, leaving a small mustache that she wiped away with the back of her hand. "Sarah Chen," she replied simply. She was a nurse at Seattle General Hospital. She worked with the tiny babies, the ones who were born too early or got sick. She used to tell me stories about helping them get strong enough to go home to their families. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. His coffee cup slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, crashing to the floor in an explosion of ceramic shards and hot liquid. The sharp sound made Mason jump and whimper, but Richard barely noticed the commotion around them or the concerned looks from other diners. Sarah Chen. The name echoed through his mind like a bell tolling, bringing with it a flood of memories he'd spent 9 years trying to forget. Sarah Chen, the beautiful, compassionate nurse who'd worked the night shift in the neonatal intensive care unit at Seattle General. The woman who'd held his hand during the darkest period of his life, when his first company was failing and his beloved father was dying slowly and painfully from pancreatic cancer. Sarah, who'd cared for his father during those final, agonizing weeks in the hospital, who'd shown Richard more kindness and understanding than he'd thought possible from a stranger, the woman he'd fallen desperately, completely in love with during those long nights in the hospital corridors, waiting for news that never got better. Sarah, who'd made him believe in love again when he'd thought his heart had died, along with his dreams of business success. Sarah, who disappeared from his life without warning one grey March morning, leaving only a handwritten note on his apartment door. "Richard, I have to go away. Please don't look for me. This isn't about you. You are a wonderful man, and you deserve happiness. Love always, S." Lucy watched with growing alarm as the nice man who'd bought her dinner began to tremble violently, his face cycling through colors from pale white to flushed red. She'd seen adults have breakdowns before. It was unfortunately common on the streets, but something about his reaction felt different, more personal, more connected to her specifically. "Mr. Sterling," she said softly, reaching across the table to touch his hand with her small, warm fingers. "Are you sick? Should I get help?" Richard flinched at her touch, not because he didn't want it, but because the simple contact sent an electric shock of recognition through his entire body. Those hands, so small and delicate, had the same long, artistic fingers as Sarah's. The same gentle way of offering comfort without asking questions first. His mind was racing, calculating dates with mathematical precision. Sarah had disappeared in March 2015. Lucy had said she was 8 years old, which would put her birth in 2016. 9 months, exactly 9 months, after Sarah had vanished from his life without explanation. "Lucy," he said, his voice hoarse with barely contained emotion, "I need to ask you something very important. Do you have any pictures of your mother?" Lucy's expression grew solemn, and she nodded slowly. With the reverence of someone handling a precious relic, she reached into her worn backpack and carefully extracted a small photograph from a zippered inside pocket. The edges were soft with handling, the colors slightly faded, but the image was clear. She passed it across the table like it was made of spun glass, her most treasured possession. Richard took the photograph with shaking hands, and his entire world shifted on its axis. It was Sarah, exactly as he remembered her, beautiful, radiant, her dark hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she'd worn during her shifts. She was wearing her hospital scrubs, the same soft blue ones he'd seen her in countless times, and she was holding a baby who could only be Lucy. The infant in the photo had the same dark eyes, the same serious expression, even as a newborn. On the back of the photograph, in Sarah's familiar handwriting, the same careful script that had written him that devastating goodbye note, were the words, "Lucy Chen Martinez, born March 15th, 2016, my beautiful miracle baby, all my love forever." The date confirmed everything with brutal clarity. March 15th, 2016. Exactly 9 months and 1 week after Sarah had disappeared from his life. She'd been pregnant when she left him, She'd been carrying his child and had chosen to face it alone rather than burden him with the news during the worst crisis of his life. "Lucy," Richard said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, "your mother. Did she ever mention anyone named Richard? Maybe someone she used to know before you were born?" Lucy's eyes lit up with sudden, brilliant recognition, and she leaned forward eagerly. "Richard, yes! Oh my goodness, yes!" Her voice grew animated, excited. "Mama used to tell me stories about a man named Richard all the time. She said he was the bravest, kindest person she'd ever known. She said he had the biggest heart and the gentlest hands, and that he could make anything better just by caring about it." Richard felt tears begin to stream down his cheeks, but he couldn't look away from Lucy's glowing face. "Mama said Richard would have loved me so much if things had been different," Lucy continued, her voice growing wistful. "She said I got his stubbornness and his way of thinking too hard about everything, and she said—" Lucy paused, studying Richard's face with new intensity. "She said I had his eyes when I was concentrating really hard on something important." The pieces were falling into place with devastating, beautiful clarity, but Richard needed absolute certainty before he could fully process the magnitude of this revelation. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the photograph. "Lucy, do you know why your mother left Seattle? Why she never told this Richard about you?" Lucy's expression grew sad, and she unconsciously began folding another napkin into an airplane. A nervous habit, Richard realized with a start, that she'd inherited from her mother. Sarah had done origami when she was stressed, creating delicate paper flowers and birds during their late-night conversations in the hospital waiting room. "Mama got really scared when she found out she was pregnant," Lucy said quietly, her voice taking on the careful tone of a child, repeating something she'd been told many times. "She said Richard was going through something terrible with his family, and his business was in trouble, and she didn't want to make his life any harder than it already was. She thought maybe he wouldn't want a baby right then, when everything else was so difficult." Richard felt like his heart was being systematically torn apart and rebuilt at the same time. Sarah had been pregnant during his father's final illness, during the catastrophic failure of his first company, during the period when he'd been barely holding himself together from day to day. She'd made the impossible decision to protect him from additional stress, sacrificing her own happiness and their relationship to spare him further pain. "But Mama always said she made the wrong choice," Lucy continued, her voice growing smaller and more vulnerable, especially when she got really sick with the cancer. "She said she should have told Richard the truth from the beginning, because love is always stronger than fear. She made me promise." Lucy's voice caught slightly. "She made me promise that if I ever found someone who loved me, I wouldn't run away from them, no matter how scared I got. She said that was her biggest mistake, and she didn't want me to make the same one." Tears were streaming down Richard's face now, and he didn't care who saw them. Mason, sensing his father's intense emotion, had stopped playing with his airplanes and was patting Richard's arm with gentle concern, making soft, worried sounds. "Daddy sad?" Mason asked, using one of his clearest phrases while looking between Richard and Lucy with confusion. "No, buddy," Richard managed to say through his tears, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion. "Daddy's not sad. Daddy's found something he's been looking for his whole life, without even knowing he was looking for it." He reached across the table and gently took Lucy's small hands in his larger ones, marveling at how perfectly they fit together, how right this felt despite the impossibility of the situation. "Lucy," he said, his voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside him, "how would you feel about coming home with Mason and me? Not to a shelter or a foster home, but home, forever home. A place where you'd never have to be hungry or cold or alone ever again." Lucy's paper airplane slipped from her fingers, landing forgotten on her untouched hamburger. Her eyes grew impossibly wide, and for a moment she looked exactly like the infant in Sarah's photograph. Serious, contemplative, wise beyond her years. "You mean it?" she whispered. "Really and truly? You'd want me to stay with you forever?" "I mean it more than I've ever meant anything in my entire life," Richard said, squeezing her hands gently. "You and Mason and me, we'd be a family, a real family." What he didn't tell her. Not yet. Not until he could have DNA tests run, and legal papers prepared, and medical records obtained, and 1,000 other practical matters sorted out, was that he wasn't just offering her a home out of kindness or pity. He was bringing his daughter home where she belonged. He was reclaiming the family that had been torn apart by fear and misunderstanding, and the cruel twists of fate that had kept them separated for 8 long years. Outside the restaurant windows, the storm that had brought them together was finally beginning to clear, revealing patches of star-scattered sky between the dissipating clouds. For the first time in 9 years, Richard Sterling felt like he could breathe again. The most important deal of his life hadn't happened in a boardroom after all. It had happened over hamburgers and chocolate milk and paper airplanes. With the daughter he'd never known he had, and the son who'd brought them together through the simple magic of a child's tears and another child's boundless compassion. 3 hours later, Richard Sterling sat in his penthouse office overlooking downtown Seattle, his hands shaking as he dialed the number for Marcus Webb, the most discreet private investigator in the Pacific Northwest. Lucy and Mason were asleep in his guest bedroom, exhausted from the emotional day, but Richard couldn't rest until he had answers. "Marcus, it's Richard Sterling. I need you to drop everything and work on something for me tonight. I'm sending you a photograph and some information about a woman named Sarah Chen who worked at Seattle General Hospital 9 years ago." Marcus Webb had worked for Richard before, tracking down corporate spies and investigating potential business partners. But he'd never heard such raw desperation in his client's voice. "What exactly are you looking for, Mr. Sterling?" "Everything," Richard said, staring out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon. "Medical records, employment history, death certificate, hospital staff who knew her. I need to know what happened to her after she left Seattle in 2015, and more importantly, I need to know about her daughter." "Her daughter?" Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 8 lost years pressing against his chest. I think the little girl sleeping in my guest room might be my biological daughter, and if I'm right, then someone has a lot of explaining to do about how she ended up living on the streets." 2 floors below, Lucy stirred in the most comfortable bed she'd ever experienced, surrounded by soft pillows and warm blankets that smelled like expensive fabric softener. She'd taken a hot shower, her first real shower in weeks, and Mrs. Patterson, Richard's housekeeper, had found her some of Mason's older clothes that were almost the right size. But despite the luxury surrounding her, Lucy couldn't quite believe this was real. Adults had disappointed her too many times before. Foster families who'd sent her back to the system, social workers who'd made promises they couldn't keep, shelter workers who'd looked at her with pity rather than hope. She pulled Sarah's photograph from under her pillow and whispered to it in the darkness, "Mama, I think I found him. I think I found my daddy, but I'm scared he's going to change his mind when he finds out how much trouble I am." In the master bedroom, Richard made call after call, mobilizing resources that only unlimited wealth could provide. DNA testing labs that would work through the night, family court judges who owed him favors, the best child psychologists in the city who could help Lucy adjust to her new reality. But first, he needed proof. He needed to know for certain that his heart wasn't playing tricks on him, that the overwhelming recognition he'd felt wasn't just wishful thinking born from loneliness and regret. His phone rang at 3 a.m. Marcus Webb's voice was grim. "Richard, you're going to want to sit down for this." Marcus Webb had seen a lot of disturbing things in his 20-year career as a private investigator. But the Sarah Chen file made his stomach turn. He met Richard at a 24-hour diner near the waterfront, spreading documents across the sticky table between coffee cups and untouched pie. "She died 3 years ago," Marcus began without preamble. "Cervical cancer, stage 4. She fought it for 18 months before it finally took her." Richard nodded grimly. He'd suspected as much from what Lucy had told him, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the gut. "But here's where it gets complicated," Marcus continued, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Sarah didn't just disappear from Seattle in 2015. She disappeared from the entire system. No forwarding address, no employment records, no medical insurance claims. It's like she vanished into thin air until she showed up in Portland in 2017. "Portland?" Richard opened the folder, scanning the documents with growing confusion. "Why Portland?" "Because that's where she went to have the baby. There's a birth certificate for Lucy Chen Martinez, born March 15, 2016, at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital. Mother listed as Sarah Chen, father listed as unknown." Richard's hands tightened on the papers. "Unknown? She really never told them about me." "It gets worse," Marcus said grimly. "After Lucy was born, Sarah struggled. Single mother? No family support? Working minimum wage jobs to survive? When Lucy was 3, Child Protective Services got involved. There were concerns about Sarah's ability to provide adequate care." The diner seemed to spin around Richard as Marcus continued his devastating report. "Sarah was terrified of losing Lucy to the system. So she ran again, took the kid and disappeared for 2 years, living in homeless shelters, moving from city to city. By the time Sarah was diagnosed with cancer in 2019, Lucy had never been to school, never had proper medical care, never had any kind of stable life." Richard felt sick while he'd been building his second fortune. Buying luxury cars and investing in tech startups, his daughter had been living in homeless shelters with a mother who was slowly dying. When Sarah realized she wasn't going to survive the cancer, she made arrangements, Marcus continued. She left Lucy with a woman named Rosa Martinez in Tacoma. Rosa's the one who gave Lucy the Martinez part of her last name. But Rosa was elderly and sick herself. She died 6 months after Sarah and Lucy. Lucy just disappeared again. "An 8-year-old girl, completely alone in the world," Richard whispered. "The system lost track of her completely. No foster placement, no school enrollment, nothing. She's been invisible for the past year, surviving God knows how." Richard stared at the documents, trying to process the magnitude of what Sarah had endured alone. She'd given up everything to protect him from the burden of an unplanned pregnancy. And it had cost her and Lucy everything. "There's one more thing," Marcus said quietly. "I found Sarah's personal effects. Rosa Martinez saved them for Lucy." He slid a small box across the table. "There are letters in there. Letters she wrote, but never sent." Richard's hands shook as he opened the box and saw his name written in Sarah's familiar handwriting across dozens of envelopes. Love letters that had never found their way home. Richard Sterling's mansion felt different, with children's laughter echoing through its halls. For 3 weeks, he'd watched Lucy slowly emerge from her protective shell, blooming like a flower, finally getting adequate sunlight and water. The DNA test results had confirmed what his heart already knew. Lucy Chen Martinez was his daughter, sharing 99.7% of his genetic markers. But legal confirmation was one thing. Emotional healing was quite another. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the child psychologist Richard had hired, met with Lucy twice a week in the sunroom that had been converted into a comfortable therapy space. Through patient conversations and play therapy, Lucy was slowly opening up about her years of trauma and survival. She's remarkably resilient, Dr. Walsh told Richard during one of their private consultations, but she's also hypervigilant. She's constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to decide you don't want her anymore. Richard watched through the window as Lucy and Mason played in the backyard, building elaborate paper airplane fleets and launching them from the deck. Mason's autism symptoms had improved dramatically since Lucy's arrival. Her calming presence seemed to regulate his emotions in ways that expensive therapies never had. "How do I convince her that this is permanent?" Richard asked. "How do I make up for 8 years of abandonment that wasn't even my fault?" "Time," Dr. Walsh replied simply. "Consistency, and eventually, the truth." Richard had been dreading that conversation. How do you tell an 8-year-old that you're her biological father? How do you explain that her mother had loved them both enough to sacrifice her own happiness to keep them apart? That evening, as Lucy helped him prepare dinner, she'd insisted on learning to cook real food. Richard decided it was time. "Lucy, there's something I need to tell you about your mother and me." Lucy's hands stilled on the carrots she was cutting with careful precision. "Are you going to send me away now?" "No, sweetheart, never. But you deserve to know the truth about who you are and where you come from." Richard pulled out the box of letters Sarah had written but never sent. "Your mother loved me very much, just like she loved you, and I loved her more than I've ever loved anyone." Lucy's eyes grew wide as she recognized her mother's handwriting on the envelopes. "Before you were born, your mama and I were planning to be together forever, but then some very hard things happened. My father got sick and died. My business was failing, and I was sad and angry all the time. Your mama was pregnant with you, but she was scared that if she told me, I wouldn't be happy about having a baby when everything else was so difficult." Lucy set down her knife, giving Richard her complete attention. "So she made a choice to protect me from worrying about her and you. She thought she was doing the right thing, but it meant that I never got to know about you until 3 weeks ago in that airport." "You mean?" Lucy's voice was barely a whisper. "You're my daughter, Lucy, my biological daughter. The DNA tests confirmed it, but honestly, I knew it in my heart the moment I saw you fold that first paper airplane." Tears started streaming down Lucy's face, but for the first time since Richard had known her, they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of coming home. The law offices of Patterson, Williams and Associates buzzed with tension as Richard Sterling faced the most important legal battle of his life. Across the polished conference table sat Margaret Thornfield, the state social worker who'd been assigned to Lucy's case after Richard had officially reported finding her. "Mr. Sterling," Miss Thornfield said in a voice that could freeze coffee, "while I don't question your good intentions, the fact remains that this child has been missing from the system for over a year. There are protocols that must be followed." Richard's attorney, David Chen, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, leaned forward. "My client has submitted DNA evidence proving paternal relationship, financial statements demonstrating his ability to provide care, and psychological evaluations showing Lucy's dramatic improvement in his custody." "That may be true," Ms. Thornfield replied coldly, "but Mr. Sterling is also a single father with a demanding career and a special needs child. Adding another traumatized child to that equation may not be in anyone's best interests." Richard felt his carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. "Are you suggesting that Lucy would be better off in foster care than with her biological father?" "I'm suggesting that there are families already approved and waiting who specialize in children with Lucy's background of trauma and neglect." The words hit Richard like physical blows. After everything Lucy had endured, after finally finding each other, the system wanted to tear them apart again. "Furthermore," Miss Thornfield continued, consulting her tablet, There are irregularities in this case that concern me. A billionaire CEO just happens to encounter a homeless child at an airport. It's an extraordinary coincidence that frankly strains credibility. David Chen slid a manila folder across the table. Perhaps this will address your concerns about credibility. Ms. Thornfield opened the folder, and her expression changed dramatically as she read the contents. Inside were copies of every letter Sarah had written to Richard but never sent, documenting her love for him, her fears about the pregnancy, and her deep regret about keeping Lucy's existence a secret. There was also a sealed letter addressed to Lucy, to be opened on her 18th birthday, explaining everything Sarah had been too afraid to say while she was alive. Sarah Chen documented her relationship with my client extensively, David continued. Hospital security footage from 2015 shows them together during his father's final illness. Bank records show financial support he provided for her father's medical care. This isn't a coincidence, Ms. Thornfield. This is a father who lost his daughter through a tragic misunderstanding and found her again through what can only be described as divine intervention. Ms. Thornfield read through Sarah's letters in stunned silence. The raw emotion in Sarah's words was impossible to fake or dismiss. "There's one more thing," Richard said quietly. "Lucy's been having nightmares every night since she found out about the custody hearing. She thinks you're going to take her away from Mason and me. She's barely eating, barely sleeping." He pulled out his phone and showed Ms. Thornfield a video from the previous evening. Lucy and Mason were in the playroom, building an elaborate paper airplane city. But Lucy's movements were mechanical, distracted, and she kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to come and take her away. "That little girl has been abandoned by every adult she's ever trusted," Richard said, his voice breaking. "Please, don't make me another person who promises to keep her safe and then lets the system tear her away." Ms. Thornfield closed the folder and was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she looked up at Richard with something that might have been respect. "Mr. Sterling, I'm going to recommend immediate permanent custody placement with you as Lucy's father, but I'll be conducting regular follow-up visits for the next 6 months to ensure Lucy's continued well-being." Richard felt like he could breathe again for the first time in weeks. Thank you so much." But Miss Thornfield wasn't finished. "There's just one more hurdle we need to address. Lucy's been out of school for over a year. She'll need intensive educational support to catch up to her grade level." Richard smiled for the first time during the entire meeting. "I think I have that covered." The Sterling family's new normal was nothing like Richard had expected, but everything he'd never known he wanted. 6 months after the custody hearing, their Mercer Island mansion had transformed from a showpiece into a home filled with the organized chaos of children's lives. Lucy's bedroom was now painted soft lavender with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. Her choice after Richard had taken her to the paint store and told her she could pick whatever she wanted. The room was filled with books, art supplies, and a special desk where she did her homeschooling assignments with Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the private tutor Richard had hired to help Lucy catch up academically. What amazed everyone was how quickly Lucy was progressing. Despite missing nearly 2 years of formal education, she was reading at a 6th grade level and showing remarkable aptitude in mathematics and science. Her paper airplane designs had evolved into complex engineering projects that impressed even Richard's team of MIT-educated developers. "She's gifted," Mrs. Hartwell told Richard during one of their weekly progress meetings, "not just academically but emotionally. She has an intuitive understanding of how things work, people, systems, relationships. It's quite remarkable for a child who's experienced so much instability, But it was Lucy's relationship with Mason that truly showed how far they'd all come. The 4-year-old boy who'd once had daily meltdowns now had entire weeks without a single episode. Lucy seemed to understand his needs intuitively, creating calm spaces for him when the world became overwhelming and engaging his interests in ways that helped him communicate more effectively. "Daddy, Lucy teached me new words today," Mason announced one evening at dinner, his speech clearer than Richard had ever heard it. "Lucy taught you new words," Richard corrected gently, smiling at his daughter. "What words did you learn?" "Aerodynamics," Mason pronounced carefully. "It's why airplanes fly. Lucy showed me with math." Richard looked at Lucy, who was blushing with pride at her little brother's enthusiasm. She'd been teaching Mason basic physics concepts through their paper airplane projects, turning playtime into impromptu science lessons. "That's wonderful, buddy. Lucy's a great teacher, isn't she?" "The best teacher in the whole world," Mason declared, reaching across the table to hold Lucy's hand. That night, after both children were asleep, Richard found himself in his home office, reading through Sarah's letters for the 100th time. Each letter was a window into the woman he'd loved and lost, documenting her struggles as a single mother, her pride in Lucy's development, and her constant worry that she'd made the wrong choice in keeping them apart. One letter, dated just 3 months before Sarah's death, stood out. "My dearest Richard, Lucy asked me again today about her father. She's so smart, so curious about everything. I see you in her every day, in her stubborn determination, in her compassion for others, in the way she figures out complicated problems by thinking through every possible angle. I know I was wrong to keep her from you. I was scared and young, and I thought I was protecting you from a burden you didn't need. But watching her grow up without a father has shown me that love isn't a burden. It's a gift. And I robbed both of you of that gift because I was too afraid to trust in the strength of what we had together. If something happens to me, if you ever find her somehow, please know that every choice I made was motivated by love. Love for you, love for her, love for the family we could have been if I'd been braver. She deserves to know her father. She deserves to know that she was created from the most beautiful love I've ever experienced. And you deserve to know what an incredible person she's becoming. I pray somehow, someday, you'll find each other. All my love, always and forever, Sarah." Richard wiped tears from his eyes and made a decision. Tomorrow he would take Lucy and Mason to visit Sarah's grave in Portland. It was time for Lucy to say a proper goodbye to her mother, and for Richard to finally thank Sarah for the greatest gift she could have given him, their daughter. But first, there was something else he needed to do, something that would complete their family in a way he'd never imagined possible. Richard reached for his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized weeks ago. "Dr. Walsh? It's Richard Sterling. I know it's late, but I need to ask you about the adoption process. Not for Lucy, she's already my daughter, but Mason. I want Mason to know that Lucy is officially his sister in every way that matters. Is it possible to have Lucy legally adopt him as her brother, even though I'm their guardian?" Dr. Walsh's warm laughter came through the phone. "Richard, that's not quite how adoption works. But I understand what you're trying to accomplish. You want to formalize their sibling bond." "Exactly. They've found each other, and I want to make sure nothing ever separates them again." "Then let me tell you about sibling adoption policies and how we can make sure that Lucy and Mason are legally recognized as family in every way possible." As Richard listened to Dr. Walsh explain the process, he looked out his office window at the Seattle skyline that had once represented nothing but business success and corporate achievement. Now it represented something far more valuable: home, a place where his children were safe, loved, and free to grow into whatever amazing people they were meant to become. The little girl who'd saved his son with paper airplanes had saved them all, bringing a family together that had been scattered by fear and misunderstanding for far too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new opportunities to build the life they'd all been searching for without even knowing it. But tonight, for the first time in 9 years, Richard Sterling fell asleep, knowing that his family was complete. 1 year later, Richard Sterling stood in the same Seattle-Tacoma airport terminal where his life had changed forever, but this time he wasn't alone. Lucy held Mason's hand as they walked toward their departure gate, both children chattering excitedly about their upcoming vacation to Hawaii, Lucy's first trip on an actual airplane, Mason's first time seeing the ocean. "Daddy, remember when we first met here?" Lucy asked, skipping slightly as they walked. She was taller now, healthier, with the confident posture of a child who knew she was loved unconditionally. "How could I forget?" Richard replied, adjusting the strap of the backpack filled with Lucy's ever-present paper airplane supplies. "That was the best day of my life, even though I didn't know it at the time." Mason had grown tremendously as well. His speech was clearer, his social skills had improved dramatically, and his bond with Lucy had become the foundation for remarkable developmental progress. The little boy who'd once had meltdowns was now explaining aerodynamics to anyone who would listen, thanks to his sister's patient teaching. As they reached their gate, Richard noticed a familiar figure across the terminal. A harried-looking mother was struggling with 3 young children, one of whom was crying inconsolably while she tried to manage luggage and keep the other 2 from wandering off. Lucy noticed too, her empathetic nature immediately drawn to the distressed family. Without hesitation, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a sheet of paper. "Can I go help?" she asked Richard, already moving toward the struggling family. "Of course, sweetheart, but stay where I can see you." Richard and Mason watched as Lucy approached the overwhelmed mother with the same gentle confidence she'd shown that first day. She knelt down to the crying child's level and began folding a paper airplane, her movements sure and practiced. Within minutes, the child had stopped crying, fascinated by Lucy's creation. The mother looked up with tears of gratitude as Lucy showed her other children how to make simple paper planes of their own. "Lucy's magic," Mason observed sagely, clapping his hands as he watched his sister work her particular brand of miracle. "She makes everyone happy with airplanes." Richard felt his chest swell with pride and something deeper, a profound sense of rightness about the path that had brought them to this moment. Lucy wasn't just his daughter. She was becoming exactly the kind of person Sarah had dreamed she would be. Compassionate, intelligent, generous with her gifts, and unafraid to reach out to others in need. Their flight was called, and Lucy returned to them with bright eyes and a huge smile. "The little boy's name is Tommy, and he was scared about flying for the first time. I told him airplanes are just really big paper airplanes that carry people to amazing places." As they boarded the plane, Richard reflected on the incredible journey that had brought their family together. Sterling Industries had not only survived the crisis that had nearly destroyed it, but had thrived. Partly because Richard's priorities had shifted dramatically. He'd learned to delegate more effectively, to value time with his children over endless board meetings, and to measure success not just in profits, but in the laughter that filled his house every evening. Lucy had started attending a prestigious private school, where her combination of academic brilliance and emotional intelligence had made her a favorite among both teachers and classmates. She'd also begun volunteering at Seattle Children's Hospital, teaching origami to young patients, a way of honoring her mother's memory while using her gifts to help others. Mason had been accepted into an innovative program for children with autism spectrum disorders, where his newfound communication skills and Lucy's patient advocacy had opened doors Richard had never imagined possible. But perhaps most importantly, they'd found Sarah's final gift to all of them, a letter she'd left with her personal effects. To be given to Lucy when she was ready to understand love's most difficult truths. Dr. Walsh had determined that Lucy was ready 6 months ago, and the letter had provided the final piece of healing their family had needed. My beautiful Lucy, if you're reading this, then the miracle I prayed for every day has finally happened. You've found your father, and you've learned that love is stronger than fear, stronger than time, stronger than all the mistakes people make when they're trying to protect each other. Your father is a good man, the best man I've ever known. I hope by now you understand why I made the choices I did, and I hope you can forgive me for the years we lost. But more than anything, I hope you know that every single day of your life has been precious to me. And every day you have with your father will be precious too. Be brave, my darling girl. Be kind. Be generous with your gifts. And remember that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most broken places, like flowers growing through cracks in concrete, or families finding each other when they thought they were lost forever. Love each other. Take care of each other. And never ever let fear make decisions for your heart. All my love, always and always. Mama! As their plane taxied down the runway, Lucy pressed her face to the window and watched Seattle disappear beneath the clouds. Mama would be so happy, she whispered, partly to herself and partly to Richard, who was sitting beside her. She would be, Richard agreed, taking her hand in his. She would be so proud of the young lady you're becoming. Mason, buckled into the seat across the aisle, was practicing the paper airplane folding techniques Lucy had taught him. His tongue stuck out in concentration as he worked to get the creases just right. "Daddy," Lucy said as they reached cruising altitude. Do you think there are other families out there who are separated like we were? Kids who don't know where they belong? Richard looked at his daughter's serious, thoughtful expression and recognized the seeds of something that might grow into a life's mission. "I think there probably are, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" "I was thinking. Maybe when I grow up, I could help them find each other, like you found me." Richard squeezed her hand, his heart overflowing with love and pride. "I think that would be exactly what your mother would want you to do with your gifts." As their plane soared through the clear sky toward their family vacation, Richard Sterling realized that his greatest success hadn't been building a business empire or accumulating wealth. His greatest success was sitting beside him, folding paper airplanes for her little brother, and already dreaming of ways to use her experiences to help other lost children find their way home. The little girl who'd appeared in his life like an angel, armed with nothing but folded paper and boundless compassion, had taught him the most valuable lesson of all, that love, once found, has the power to heal any wound, bridge any distance, and create miracles that transform not just individual lives, but entire families. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, love gets a second chance to grow into something even more beautiful than what was lost. Paper angels, Richard thought, watching Lucy demonstrate airplane aerodynamics to Mason with patient enthusiasm. Sometimes the most powerful angels come disguised as homeless children with nothing but paper wings and hearts big enough to save the world, one act of kindness at a time. Their family's story had begun with tears in an airport terminal, but it would continue with laughter, love, and the unshakable knowledge that they had found each other against impossible odds and would never, ever let go again. The story of Richard, Lucy, and Mason transcends the narrative of a simple family reunion. It teaches us profound truths about the nature of love, sacrifice, and redemption that echo in all our lives. Sarah Chen represents millions of people who make impossible decisions motivated by love. Her choice to walk away from Richard during her pregnancy, though it caused years of separation, was born from deep compassion. the desire to protect someone she loved from additional hardship. How many of us have made similar choices, sacrificing our own happiness in an attempt to spare others from pain? Lucy's journey through Seattle's streets illustrates the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. An 8-year-old child who lost everything yet maintained her capacity to offer kindness to strangers reminds us that our humanity isn't defined by the circumstances we face, but by how we choose to respond to them. Lucy could have become bitter, distrustful, closed off. Instead, she became a paper angel, spreading joy through simple gestures. Richard Sterling discovered that true success isn't measured in dollars or corporate achievements, but in the ability to be present for those we love. His transformation from a business-obsessed CEO to a devoted father reflects a universal truth. Life's most important things cannot be purchased, only lived and cultivated through time and attention. The role of paper airplanes as the narrative's central symbol is deeply poetic. These fragile objects, made from disposable materials, represent how life's most meaningful connections often arise from the simplest, most unexpected moments. A seemingly small gesture, one child comforting another with folded paper, can alter the course of entire lives. The story also confronts us with uncomfortable realities about our social systems. Lucy spent years invisible, lost between bureaucratic gaps, surviving through her own ingenuity. Her experience forces us to question how many other Lucys exist in our communities, waiting for someone to see them, value them, bring them home. Mason's autism and his special connection with Lucy highlight how neurological diversity can be a source of strength when embraced with understanding and love. Mason wasn't cured by his sister. He was accepted, understood, and empowered to flourish on his own unique terms. Perhaps the most powerful lesson is about the power of second chances. Sarah didn't get the opportunity to correct her decision, but the universe conspired to reunite father and daughter when they needed each other most. Life rarely offers us fairy tale endings, but occasionally gifts us with moments of grace where lost love finds a way to return. Lucy's final transformation, from a child who received kindness to a young person determined to offer it, completes the narrative circle. She understood that her gifts weren't given solely for her own salvation, but to be an instrument of healing for others. This is the true mark of emotional maturity, when our pain becomes a source of compassion for others. Paper Angels reminds us that family isn't just defined by biology, but by the choices we make to love, protect, and sacrifice for one another. Richard, Lucy, and Mason created something stronger than blood ties. They built a home based on mutual understanding, respect, and the unshakable promise to never abandon each other again. In the end, this story is a testament to hope. It assures us that even when everything seems lost, when past decisions feel irrevocable, when loneliness seems permanent, love has a way of finding a path back. Sometimes all we need is an open heart and a paper airplane to remind us that miracles still happen, one fold at a time.